There's a growing national movement to fix America's flawed social welfare system. But a missing piece of these discussions ties back to America's founding ideals. So how should we be approaching reform conversations, and what is actually needed to strengthen upward mobility for American families?
I am a veteran of this system, okay? And I couldn't navigate it.
This week, I talked with the Commissioner of Human Services for the state of Tennessee, exploring how America's promise of freedom is actually central to social safety net reform conversations. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we have a special guest to help us navigate some of the many urgent conversations in this country about social welfare reform and how to improve the way we try and help families stuck in poverty escape poverty and move closer to the American dream. To have this conversation, I'm very excited to bring into our virtual studio. His name is Clarence H. Carter, and he's the Commissioner of Human Services for the state of Tennessee. Commissioner, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Nic, thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here with you and to share some of my thinking with your audience.
Commissioner, I'm really grateful because one of the things that I think we're going to get from this conversation today is you have been doing this work for a long time. In fact, you've written a book about this work called Our Net Has Holes in It. We'll include the link to that in the show notes, of course, as well. And I want to sort of take this opportunity in this conversation to give our audience sort of an inside look from someone who's helped to run and lead these kinds of programs for a number of years in this country. We've talked about this issue a lot in this on this show, but I think it's important to recognize the kinds of things we deal with here in Utah, the kinds of things we're talking about at the national level, the kinds of things you see in Tennessee and on other past roles. We're sort of trying to build this collective, this consciousness, I guess, that says that or shows that we really do need to engage in some significant reforms to the social welfare system to make the American dream within reach for more of our fellow American families. So with that context, can you maybe first talk to us about, help our audience understand your story, how you came into this work in the first place, what you've done, and kind of how you landed there at Tennessee? Just give us kind of your experiences so we know that context going into this conversation.
So, sure, Nic. I have spent a career in the administration of human services or public safety net programs and agencies for the past 34 years. I've had the blessing and good fortune of serving in the administrations of 2 presidents, 4 governors, and a mayor, all in the administration of the benefits, goods, and services of our society to serve those that are economically, socially, and developmentally vulnerable. And I have done that, of course, at the federal, state, and local levels of government. And the 34 years in this work and developing an understanding of it that almost no one outside of it could, it prompted me to write the book Our Net Has Holes in It, because I wanted to share with the public something that, while this issue is clearly important to our broader society, almost no one outside of it knows what's inside the black box. And so I wanted to, as somebody who literally had a career inside the black box, to share with, if you would, John Q. Public, what's right and what's wrong with our safety net and how we can transform it to better serve our vulnerable neighbors.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think that context is really essential because as we've talked about this issue on here on Defending Ideas for a number of years now, a number of episodes where we've tried to dive into all of this, we often bring data and analysis, and here at Sutherland Institute, we're a public policy think tank. So that's what we do. We put out research papers and events and media content like this to try and help understand this. And we've had folks sitting in the studio with us who are participants in the social safety net who can tell us what it's like to experience it. And so I think your perspective, especially working at the federal level, at the state level in different states, you've kind of attacked this issue, if you will, from many different vantage points over the years. And I want to ask how that fed into the book. I mean, as you looked around at your experiences administering social welfare programs in various parts of the country over decades, and then looked at sort of the way the public perceives or the way policymakers perceive that system, what is your hope that your book will do? Again, the book title, Our Net Has Holes in It. I guess, why did you feel like, well, I've got to write this? We need this to help us better understand these issues, to make improvements.
So Nick, it begins with an understanding that this country, it is the most benevolent and generous nation known to humankind. And I start the book off by delving into that some and how we manifest that benevolent spirit. And so it begins with the fact that we care about human vulnerability, and whether that human vulnerability is amongst our own citizenry or all across the world. Okay. We give a damn about vulnerability. And one of the ways we manifest that is that we expend, federal government alone spends $1.49 trillion annually in 114 programs, each designed to address some aspect of human vulnerability. Okay. And so we care enough, we spend enough. Why do we have the poor outcomes that we have? And so the motivation was, this clearly is something that our entire citizenry cares about. How can we build on what we have to do this better for our vulnerable neighbors that desperately need some kind of supports to help them make their version of the American dream come true? That really is the motivation behind the book.
Commissioner, I love the weaving in of the American dream idea because it gets to sort of the aspirational purpose, or what should be the aspirational purpose of a social safety net at all here in the United States. So I love that framing, that when we talk with, it's usually single moms with some kids who are on these government programs. When we, and again, we've had some of them in this chair right here. I'm pointing to our chair in our physical studio here, sharing their story. They don't want to be on these programs if they could avoid it. They don't want to stay on these programs. They want to work and achieve work-based self-reliance. And there really is this hunger for the American dream in these folks. So I love that framing. I wonder if you can share, if in a couple minutes, and then we'll take a break. And then when we come back from the break, I want to dive into some more detail about what you articulate in your book and kind of what you've seen in your role there in Tennessee and elsewhere. But if there was kind of one key takeaway from your book that you would really want people to remember, regular voters especially, as well as policymakers, when we're thinking about or talking about opportunity policy, what's the one big thing that you think gets missed that we have to remember in these conversations?
That we have to have a shared vision for our societal objective for those neighbors experiencing some form of vulnerability. And I believe that shared vision has got to be freedom for them to be able to carry out their unique version of the American dream. We have built a system, unfortunately, which is really more about the delivery of benefits, goods, and services. And we've lost the notion of what we came here to do. And I think what we should have come here to do is to free people to act in their own best interest. So the most important takeaway is first the shared vision. And then that shared vision ought to be, how do we, very much in the context of the framers of our society, they set out to create a society where the greatest degree of freedom could be experienced by the citizenry while protecting for health, safety, and commerce. And so it stands to reason that all of the organs of that society ought to support that foundation principle of freedom. That needs to be the shared vision of our safety net.
That is not something I have heard that much in social safety net conversations. So we need to take a quick break. But when we come back, I want to keep going on that thread, because I think the American dream framing, the freedom framing, is something that really does get missed in these conversations. So for our audience, hold that thought in your heads for the next minute or so as we take a quick break. We're going to come back. Again, we're talking with Clarence H. Carter, Commissioner of Human Services for the state of Tennessee, here on Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation with Commissioner Clarence H. Carter from the state of Tennessee, but want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, make sure you subscribe to Defending Ideas on any of the major platforms. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. Just plug in Defending Ideas in the search bar and click subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the little bell icon on your screen so you get notified each time a new episode of Defending Ideas drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all of that wherever you get your shows or at defendingideas.org. Commissioner, you said something before the break that I want to build on, this idea of framing social safety net delivery and reform around this idea of freedom and the American dream. And that's, to be honest, that's not something that you hear a whole lot in these kinds of conversations. I want to read an excerpt from your book, Our Net Has Holes in It, which again we'll include a link to in the show notes for our audience. I want to read this excerpt because I think this kind of captures what you're saying, that I wonder if you can expand on it for us to help us fill in the gaps of what we don't typically hear in social safety net conversations. So here's the excerpt from your book. You write, "The most fundamental problem with the American safety net is its lack of a shared vision and overarching objective. This book endeavors to offer a shared vision, an overarching objective, and a pathway to get there. We begin with a grounding principle that the American safety net should align with and support the intentions of the founders of our nation. They set out to create a society where all the citizenry could enjoy the greatest degree of freedom while still having support for their safety, health, and commerce. Following those founding principles, we believe that the safety net, or system of public support, should be dedicated to ultimately enhancing that individual freedom envisioned by the founders." Again, that's from your book, Our Net Has Holes in It. Commissioner, the reason I kind of fixate on that, and in conjunction with the comments you just made, is normally, I've been to a lot of events and spoken about this issue often to a number of different audiences, and, usually great constructive conversations about this stuff. those of us who are our audience out there watching or listening to this, they probably hear about this stuff in the news. There was, of course, a lot of discussion last year in the One Big Beautiful Bill about things like work requirements. And so those who are in or sort of familiar with the discussion around social welfare policy and safety nets and things like that, it is usually dominated by, well, how do we provide services to folks to alleviate material suffering? And then we're trying to tack on more of the, well, we also want to help get them back on their feet and move toward work-based self-reliance. Your framing is a little different. It's different in a positive way. It's this aspirational. I'll be honest, I don't know that I've heard at all, or certainly not very often, connecting the purpose of a government-funded social safety net back to the founding ideas from America's founding fathers. Can you expand that a little bit for us? Because that's really unique, I think.
The problem with the safety net writ large is it is something that we, if you would cobble together over time and different political events, but we did not have a true north in mind. It would have been, whatever the events were of the moment, it had us build something or tack something on. And we never took the time to say, when I was a youngster, my father said to me often, when you're up to your elbows in alligators, it's difficult to remember that your original intention was to drain the swamp. And so my question, the one that Net sets out to answer is, what is our original intention? And so I go back to that mother sitting in that chair that you referred to, okay? One of the first lessons that came to me in my work in this space is no one in their right mind wants to be a ward of the government this way, okay? Now, they may not believe they have the capacity to not be, but no one chooses to be. And so what I believe then the role of our system of public support should be is to help that vulnerable individual or family find their way beyond that vulnerability to their own freedom. Because again, that's what the founders said is the basis for, okay? And unfortunately, we have devolved into that very discussion that you just laid out, okay? Again, not focusing on sort of an overarching intention. And there's a particular place in the book that I want to bring to your listeners' attention. It's a chapter on the Winchester Mystery House. And let me explain quickly. The Winchester Mystery House is the home of Sarah Winchester, who is the heir to the Winchester rifle fortune. Born and raised in Connecticut, Sarah had a couple of very significant tragedies. She lost her only child, her daughter, to a horrible childhood disease, and not long after lost her husband to a disease. And being a spiritual individual, she went to see some mediums to ask them what she should do with the rest of her life. And the guidance that she got was that she should move out west and start a building project that would help atone for all the lives that had been taken by the Winchester rifle. She moves to San Jose, California. She purchases an 8-room farmhouse. She hires a construction crew and begins a process every day for the next 33 years. She would sketch something on a napkin, give it to her construction crew, and tell them to make that. Years later, this 8-room farmhouse was a 166-room edifice, okay? But the challenge is the edifice made no sense. There are stairways that are right into ceilings. There are beautiful stained glass windows up against brick. There are doors that you open that if you open the door and you take a step, you will step to your death, okay? And I use the metaphor of the Winchester Mystery House to juxtapose against our system of public supports. We just, without any kind of architectural rendering, without a blueprint, we just put stuff together, program after program after program after program, with no overarching thought. And so those folks who are in the positions that I'm in, who administer this system, what we get held accountable for is administering those programs. We don't get held accountable for the well-being of that woman in that chair. And that's my argument. Shouldn't our intention be that person's freedom and well-being to live a life beyond being a ward of the government?
Commissioner, that's an incredibly powerful metaphor, and it's much more thoughtful than the one I usually use in these kinds of conversations when I go and speak about social welfare reform. I've often invoked the example from the Harry Potter books. The Weasley's house is sort of haphazardly designed and odd, but it's held up by magic. That's the only reason it works. And so, but it's funny because it's a similar kind of thing. It's like the system is not really designed. It's sort of cobbled together haphazardly in a way that creates tremendous problems. It's tough for states to administer. Here in Utah, we have what's been called now the one-door model, where the large bulk of these social welfare programs and our workforce development programs are co-located under one statewide agency, and that's created some real advantages for us here as a state. But it's still sort of, we're doing the best we can at the state level with a very poorly designed federal system. And then also it's tough for the family. So can you maybe expand on that? How do you view sort of the poor design, and what's the practical effect of that for you at the state level, for the families you're trying to serve?
The practical effect is that we have created a maze for that consumer that needs these supports to navigate. And Nick, the truth is, okay, I am a veteran of this system, okay, and I couldn't navigate it, okay? There is no way that a family struggling to put a roof over their head, or someone in the depths of addiction, or someone just coming out of incarceration could ever navigate the mess that we put together. And while there are interventions in that maze, again, for every condition known to humankind, it wasn't designed in a way to be able to navigate it. And so I think that this is something that we'll spend a little bit of time on in the next segment, but it creates things like the benefits cliff, in which, because we have no overarching intention, and the programs were not meant, they weren't built to work in conjunction, you put consumers in a difficult space to make poor choices on their own behalf. And what really troubles me, Nick, is that we ultimately, in many corridors, blame the consumer for the flaws of design and operation of the system, okay? The system actually puts people in a place to make decisions that are not in their best interest. And nobody in their right mind would do that.
Commissioner, we need to take another quick break. When we come back, I want to dive in a little bit more, as you mentioned, the benefit cliffs and some of the perverse incentives inadvertently built into the social welfare system that, as you rightly point out, that These are families who are making rational decisions for themselves based on a very poorly designed system. And so I want to touch on that and then maybe round out the conversation with solutions or kind of next steps. How do we fix all this, basically, that this is decades in the making. You wrote an entire book about it. We're going to figure out how to fix it in 10 minutes in our next segment. But so we'll try and do that. And again, this is Commissioner Clarence H. Carter from the state of Tennessee, Commissioner of Human Services there, on defending ideas. We're going to get into all of that in the next segment. Please don't go anywhere.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to continue our conversation with Commissioner Carter from Tennessee about how to reform and improve the social welfare system here in this country to make the American dream within reach for more of our fellow American families hungry to escape poverty. But I want to remind you to subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows, whether you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can find us on YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows. Click subscribe and click the bell icon on YouTube so you get a notification each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. You can also find us at defendingideas.org. Can access this and previous conversations and short clips that you can use in your own conversations about these issues. Again, defendingideas.org or wherever you get your shows. Commissioner, to round out the conversation, you mentioned something right before the break, this idea of benefit cliffs, something that we talk about often on the show, and we've done a lot of work on here at Sutherland Institute here in Utah. We put together some survey data in 2024 where we could actually measure sort of the disincentive effect that benefit cliffs have for families. And just as a refresher for our audience, this is a situation where a family that's on the social safety net, if they increase their earnings, if they earn a little bit more from work, that could at times trigger a loss of government benefits that can kind of cancel out those earnings or at times make them financially worse off. And we found that when we surveyed statewide, it was about 43% of Utah's current or recent safety net population said that at some point they had turned down a work opportunity of some kind because they were worried about triggering a benefit cliff. I want to ask you if you can expand on that as one of sort of the unfortunate byproducts of a haphazardly designed system, and anything else you see that things that need to be fixed, and then let's talk about how to fix them.
And Nick, I would begin there by saying that this notion of this issue of the benefits cliff, it is a glaring example of the ridiculous schizophrenia of the system that we have built, okay? Because, as we said, you build in disincentives for that consumer to use the system to move forward. Now, the truth is, that was not the intention of the build of the system, okay? But a good friend of mine told me once, if you're shot accidentally, you're still shot. And that is what the challenge of our system is. It literally, in many instances, shoots the very consumer it was designed to help. And so I believe, again, going back to our sort of basic premise of our net has holes in it, if we begin with an end in mind and then say, okay, how would you re-architect the existing set of supports from this vision of wanting to help that individual, that consumer on their journey to freedom, okay? And Nick, one other important framing part of this for me is, okay, much of this discussion about the safety net has really been focused on economic poverty, okay? I like to work in the broader frame of vulnerability and well-being. And I say vulnerability because vulnerability, it comes in many different dimensions. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's social, sometimes it's developmental. But it could be that family that needs help putting the meal on the table. It could be that person that's so deep in addiction they can see nothing but the next use. It could be that individual who is coming out of incarceration who needs to be reintegrated into their community. Vulnerability all over the place. And our system needs to meet that vulnerability where it is and help them create a person-centric, consumer-centric pathway beyond. Because, Nick, the challenges that would have Nick be in need of the safety net are different than the challenges for Clarence or for Dolores or Bob or whoever. And so we have to create this consumer-centric approach to the system. And in that regard, so moving to solutions, just a couple of aspects I want to touch on. The first is, and Nick, why it is so important for me to have this discussion with your audience, and I'm trying to have this with as many different audiences as possible, because we have to get this argument outside of the bureaucracy that administers it, okay? Because the bureaucracy that administers it has some built-in protections of it, okay? I want to have this discussion with John Q. Citizen, and I want to say to them, you spend almost $1.5 trillion every single year on this, and you're not getting what you set out to buy. And let me tell you why. Because I want you, John Q. Citizen, to help force the change to the system. While the system is in and of itself mammoth, okay, it's not bigger than all of us. And if we can get outside to every other sector of our society and make this case that our heart for addressing vulnerability, we are falling far short of our intentions because of this lack of shared vision and faulty design. I believe that we can force pressure internally, externally, to force the system to change.
Commissioner, I love that framing, and it's incredibly compelling to me. And it does remind me of when you use the term the heart of one of my favorite books that I reference on the show often. I think we have a copy of it on the shelf back here in the studio, but it's The Conservative Heart from Arthur Brooks, where he writes so much about and what I would articulate as an elevated, enlightened approach to alleviating poverty and creating more opportunity and upward mobility in the nation. And I view it as there is a real essential ingredient to these conversations that I think you're articulating very well, that we have to articulate the sort of the broad moral purpose of why we even have a social safety net as a country, and then how it sort of manifests in these kinds of problems we're talking about, where what I've said before when I speak about this issue to different audiences around the country is that to personalize it. So my wife and I, we have 2 little boys. They're rambunctious and fun and exhausting and wonderful. And as a parent, one of the absolute most important aspects of why I do what I do is to make sure that my family is taken care of, that they have what they need. And the way I try and articulate it to folks who may not be in the space, as you're saying, how do we talk to folks outside the bureaucracy to build a true movement, a consensus movement for reform? It's this, that if I believed that me working harder and earning more did not actually make my family better off and might actually make my family worse off, I don't know what I would do with that. That would be incredibly debilitating. And as you're saying, not just on an economic level, but on a personal, spiritual, moral level of like, what can I even do to help my family? That seems like a moral travesty as much as an economic problem in our country.
It absolutely is. And building on that, we have had a sort of back and forth that somehow work in the context of public benefits is somehow punitive. Okay? The truth is, any work that is legal, moral, and ethical, and its attendant earnings create a pathway to freedom. Create a pathway to the freedom that we want for our vulnerable neighbors. We want people to be free to act in their own best interest. And when I earn $1 to do that, then it helps me to make my way. That's an example. I did this same work in the District of Columbia, and it was important to the mayor there to move from a shelter-based homeless system to a more market-based one. And so we were closing public shelters and moving individuals into their own apartments. And one day we were in the midst of closing one of the largest men's shelters. And we had an assembly line going. Folks were signing leases and getting their keys, and then we were moving them out. Well, we had gotten to a bit of a backlog. And so gentlemen were like just sort of milling around the place, and it was clear that they were kind of restless. Now, they had gotten their keys, but we hadn't gotten to the place where we were loading them in the trucks yet. And so I called all of the men into the main space. And I asked them, I said, what time do you have to be at the shelter tonight in order to ensure you get a bed and a meal? And they said, you got to be in by 7. If you're not in by 7, you don't get a bed and a meal. And I said, and they call that intake. And I said, so what time is intake tomorrow? And you could see that there was this quizzical look on their face. What do you mean? And I said, hold up your keys. And they held up their keys. And I said, those keys mean intake tomorrow is whenever you want it. Okay? It's the freedom of, it's when you decide to put that key in your own apartment and open that door. Okay? That's the kind of freedom that we ultimately want for folks. To be able, again, to make their own way. And so you might say, as we begin to round third on this, okay, so now how you do all that? And I think we begin at the beginning, okay? And the beginning is with that shared vision, okay? And if we base it off this shared vision of freedom, then you say, okay, how do we then go back and re-architect the system so that all of those programs become tools in a toolkit to achieve our broader objective of freedom? Okay. Now, a couple of aspects of this are real important. Okay. One is Congress has got to build in some connectivity to the programs, because they weren't built to connect. And this gives me an opportunity to briefly touch on something called the Upward Mobility Act. Okay. Senator Houston out of Ohio and Representative Moore, I think, out of Utah, are sponsoring this, what would be a state-level demonstration that would allow states to pilot bringing together a number of safety net programs for the purpose of creating a comprehensive, connected approach to helping people grow beyond. Okay? It is that kind of innovation that we are going to need to re-architect our system. I've been around long enough to know, I was around back in the beginning of the Personal Responsibility Act. In fact, the demonstrations that led up to it. Now, that was 30 years ago this year for the beginning of the Personal Responsibility Act. And what was the precursor of that is states were allowed to, using the 1115 section of the Social Security Act, were allowed to, were offered waivers to demonstrate different approaches to what at that time was the major safety net program, aid to families with dependent children. Now, while that produced some great results, my argument is that was one program. It's a massive program, but it's one. Today, Nick, there are 114 safety net programs. Okay, again, all built singularly. If we were to allow states, again, in this new era of demonstration, to let's put some of those together, again, from this vision of creating freedom for folks, and with those kinds of outcomes, well-being outcomes, being how we measure success, we would begin to completely re-architect this system. So state demonstrations are going to have to happen. And the one last part of this that I'd like to share with your audience is a desperate need for this to be a whole of society approach. We have, over the course of the past 60 plus years or so, left this responsibility of being our brother's keeper. We've left it to government, okay? And we have to re-engage every sector of our society in this conversation. It's bigger than any one program. It's bigger than any one agency, but it's not bigger than all of us, okay? And the final thing I would say on this, and Nick, I get in trouble with my colleagues on this a lot, because what I say is, I don't need more money. I don't need more programs. I need more common sense, okay? And if I can bring common sense to this, we already have the things that we need in order to be able to make this transformation work.
Commissioner, as we finalize the last part of this conversation, there's a couple quick thoughts that come to mind. One, an anecdote based on what you just said. In a different role years ago, I worked for the Utah Department of Workforce Services, which here in Utah is the entity that administers all of these programs, as well as the workforce programs. Again, we have that kind of unique one-door model here in Utah. And our executive director at the time was invited to go testify before the U.S. Senate Finance Committee and talk about what we do in Utah and how we do things. And it was specifically related to an ongoing effort to address intergenerational poverty here in the state. And I was involved as one of the staffers or team members in helping to craft and refine the official testimony of our executive director. And the message that he gave, that was the message of the department and the message of Utah, was very explicitly, this is not about asking for more money. It's about asking for better use of the money we already have set aside for these things. And so that's a consistent principle with what you're saying. And it leads into kind of my final two thoughts. I want to sort of test these with you, if this is the right way to encapsulate this. If folks out there are listening to this saying, I'm persuaded by your heart, now what's the prescription? How do we move forward? To me, it seems like it's really coming down to a couple of things. Number one, a key takeaway from this is that to really fix these problems we're talking about, it's not about adding a program here or there. It's not about sort of tweaking the programs that exist. It has to be about, ultimately, in the long run, comprehensive reform to the system. And then secondly, the way to achieve that, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, push back a little bit. The way to achieve that is, I actually don't really want to go to Congress right now and say, hey, will you do comprehensive reform of the entire system to fix it, because that would be such a heavy lift politically and logistically and all these things. I would rather have Congress say, you know what? We're going to let the states experiment more. We're going to let them be innovative. We're going to let the states figure it out, because we have the model that you referenced in the 1990s, where state-led innovation and creative problem solving, that helps to create the policy answers for what should comprehensive reform look like. Is that the right framing? Is there anything you would refine, and how would you turn that into the right message for our folks to leave them with today?
I just want to make sure that to make sure we're clear on that. What Congress has to do is not enter into a massive reform, but they do have to create the enabling conditions for our demonstration. Okay, they have to enable us to be able to think beyond the borders of a program. Okay, and to bring together multiple resources in shared purpose. So if there could be a period, of a couple of years of that, then that would create the blueprint for how we can re-architect the system.
Well, we will leave it there for time. I think this is the right message moving forward. And maybe, Commissioner, one last thought. If there's anything that's on your mind that you think, I really want to make sure the audience understands this. This is, if there's one big thing folks take away from this conversation, what do you want to make sure they know moving forward so that we can have this movement, this consensus effort to restore true upward mobility for these families here in America?
I'll reiterate, Nick, that this is something we all care about, okay? Let's not continue to be lost in the forest for the trees on how to transform the system. There is a way to do it. It's not going to happen tomorrow afternoon. It's not easy, but there is a way to do this that would ultimately exemplify our heart for service to the vulnerable amongst us.
Well, Commissioner, we will have to leave it there for time. This has been excellent. Again, the book is Our Net Has Holes in It. The author is Clarence H. Carter, Commissioner of Human Services for the state of Tennessee. Thank you so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Nick, thanks so much. Pleasure to be here with you and your audience today. Be well.
Well, we're going to take one final break before we leave you all with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, and thanks again to Commissioner Clarence H. Carter from the Tennessee Department of Human Services for sharing his unique perspective and expertise on these issues. And I'll be honest, framing social welfare reform through the lens of America's founding ideals was a little different from most conversations about social safety net programs, and I actually think that's a really good thing. And it prompts a few key takeaways in my mind that I want you to try in your own conversations on these issues. First, the full promise of America could reasonably be boiled down to two core principles: freedom and opportunity. The American constitutional order protects our freedoms in essential ways, but that also means we must couple protection of rights with the opportunities to earn our own success and provide a better life for our families. That a haphazardly designed federal social welfare system at times stands in contrast to these principles is not just an economic failure, it's a moral one, which we all are committed to fixing. Second, a true fix to these challenges won't come from simply tacking on a few additional programs to the existing foundation of government benefits, nor will it be achieved by solely adjusting the existing programs. Ultimately, we will need comprehensive reform that redesigns a system in such a way that every aspect of it supports human dignity, work, families, with the ultimate goal of work-based self-reliance for American families. And lastly, this is actually possible if we properly empower states to test out new and creative ideas across programs to find solutions that you or I simply haven't thought of yet. States can and should lead as creative problem solvers, and federal policy should reflect that. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. And lastly, if you want to support the broader work of Sutherland Institute, and if you want more conversations like this one, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.